Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Freight Fraud Prevention Hub webinar. We're just going to give another minute for folks to join as we see people still joining. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Marley, I'll hand it off to you to kick us off.
Sure thing. So today we've got a pretty full agenda for you all. First, we're going to start out with welcome and introductions. We do have Scott Cornell here of TAPA, so we're very excited for the insights that he's going to bring today. And so first, again, welcome and introductions. Also, why this webinar series matters, why Scott and TAPA decided to join forces with us for the Freight Fraud Prevention Hub, and what this means to their organization. And then also we're going to talk about real world cargo theft cases and emerging trends. So Joe and Scott will have a little fireside chat and talk through some of the things that they are encountering, witnessing, hearing in the marketplace. So evolving criminal tactics and definitely some vulnerabilities. Also, we'll then hop into our threat report portal and also what we're hearing there. So this is NMFTA's new shared threat intelligence sharing platform. And so Joe will take us through a few things that your peers have submitted. Also, why layered verification matters. So Scott and Joe will certainly go down through that. This is kind of one of those main pillars of the conversation that will most certainly be throughout the conversation today. And then I will take you all on a tour of the hub, what's new, a guided walkthrough of some resources and some posts. And then lastly, how you can get involved if you are not already. And we will have a Q&A, but I believe Joe is going to be just sharing, right, some of the questions throughout. So
Mhm.
we don't have to wait until the very end for Q&A. That's all for me, Joe.
Okay. Yeah, and you'll notice at the bottom of the screen there is a button to ask questions. So again, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So if you do have questions for any of us, please feel free to ask, and we will ask those questions in the webinar. All right. So for introductions, Scott, let's have you go ahead and introduce yourself, please. It looks like, yeah, there you
Couldn't
go.
get it off mute. Sorry about that. All sorts of technical problems today, prior to and during now. So we'll just try and fight through them. Yeah, so I am currently serving as the chairman for TAPA Americas. TAPA has three chapters: TAPA Americas, TAPA EMEA, and TAPA APAC. I'm privileged to be currently serving as the chairman here. I'm also the executive vice president, SPG Cargo and Logistics, but happy to be here on behalf of TAPA and working with all of you. I have 30 plus years background in cargo theft and supply chain security, um, doing investigations and prevention and consulting and everything like that. So, really looking forward to doing this.
Thanks,
Great.
Scott, for joining us. Marley?
Sure. I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing here at NMFTA, so I oversee all strategic communications, marketing efforts, press releases, etc. And I've been in the industry 15 years now, and I was most recently, as of earlier this week, awarded a Women in Supply Chain Forum award in the Trailblazers category. So I thought it was kind of timely to share. Joe, go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks. And I'm Joe Orr, the Chief Operations and Technical Officer at NMFTA. I've been with NMFTA now 3 years, but in the industry from a technical perspective for the last 26 years. So really been focused on both technical and operations side of telematics cameras in the industry from an IT perspective. And one of the pillars that NMFTA has is cybersecurity. And a lot of the cargo crime that we see is related to cargo crime we see is related to cybersecurity. So we've really spent a lot of time focused on both cybersecurity and cargo theft.
And so real quick, I just wanted to share this slide about Scott. So brief little rundown, some bullets once more about him and his history.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So on the next slide, why this series webinar matters. Marley, do you want to kick that off?
Sure. So the Freight Fraud Prevention Hub and the webinar series kicked off back in February, and this was in conjunction with our SCAC Verified initiative, which currently is just to help with the verification process of non-Class 8 drivers and companies. So we felt that this was something that was very much needed in the industry and a way for folks from all over, right, the supply chain to come forward and talk about cyber-enabled cargo theft, strategic theft, freight fraud. So I know that Scott will definitely delve into all the terminology and such, but this is definitely something that we have seen a need for. And we're very happy with the turnout as this is our third webinar series.
Thanks, Marley.
Yep.
Okay, on the next slide. All right, so now we want to talk about some real world cargo theft cases and trends. So, Scott, you've been in the industry for a real long time. I've listened to a lot of your presentations in person and also watched a lot of the webinars that you do. Talk a little bit about real world theft cases, some of the ones that you've seen. Let's start with that.
Well, there's definitely been a change in the way that the theft has been conducted over all the time that I've been doing it. And I would tell you that for the majority of the time that I've been doing it, it was rather unsophisticated. There was a lot of it. They were really good at it, but most cargo theft was being conducted by small regional crews. They did, 99% of what they did was what we call straight theft, which means they were physically going out and stealing it. We didn't really see strategic theft hit the U.S. until probably between 2010 and 2013. And back then it was, fictitious pickups and identity theft only. Those were the only two methods. And we called everything fictitious pickup back then because that was the favorite of the two. I think as recently as 2017, strategic theft was, I think CargoNet had reported it at maybe 2% or 3% of all theft. So it was relatively insignificant. And then 2020, it blows up, and we see not only an increase in overall cargo theft, above 90% in a 3-year period increase, but a 1,475% increase in strategic theft in particular. And we went from basically 2 methods to 25 or 30 methods. So I think, when you talk about actual cargo theft cases and examples, I think some of the examples that we want to use, if we can get into the nitty gritty of a case or two if you want, but I think in general, it's better to talk in higher level terms and say, what we've seen them do is significantly adjust and be very quick about their adjustments over the past 5 or 6 years. Meaning, if we take a double brokering scam as an example, which is when they pretend to be a legitimate carrier, they get booked on a load by a freight broker, they then turn around and pretend to be a legitimate freight broker, they hire a legitimate carrier to go pick up the load on their behalf, they redirect that carrier to a cross dock or to a parking lot where they're transloaded, things like that, and they begin to launder the freight, change the paperwork on it, and put it in a container or a truck with a seal on it. And now, based on what the bill of lading says is what everybody believes is in that truck. So they kind of launder it into the legitimate supply chain. But, when double brokering scams started to come out, you see people talking about different ways to prevent. And one of the things they talk about as a key part is, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Shipper, if you're told ABC Trucking is coming to pick up the load, don't load XYZ Trucking, even if they say they're there on behalf of ABC or anything like that. Well, what we see the bad guys do in one case example is they penetrate the email of ABC Trucking. They create their own email address at ABC Trucking. They go out and they book a load as ABC Trucking. they delete all the email communications they have in ABC Trucking's email account. Then they turn around and hire ABC Trucking to go and pick up the load so that there's no questions at the point of pickup. So you see them quickly adjust to what the industry does to prevent, hey, at the point of pickup, make sure it's the right trucking company that shows up. Well, they just manipulate that on us, and they go and they not only exploit ABC Trucking's email, but then they exploit ABC Trucking to go pick up the load. And so we see them making those adjustments time and time again. We've also seen, that double brokering scam, as an example, because it's the most common method for strategic theft. More and more of those involve email penetration than they did when they first came around. At first, when they came around, it was just, the trickery on the phone or the trickery on the emails of who they were pretending to be. But now it's loaded with email penetration so that the email is legitimate. So again, the industry points out, hey, pay attention to the email, pay attention to the domain. Well, now the emails are legit, right? Or they commit MC fraud as they do the double brokering scam. So now you're looking at what appears to be a legitimate trucking company because they purchased the MC, they purchased the logins, they purchased the email, they purchased the phone number. So they keep adjusting to everything that the industry does to try and prevent the thefts. And I think that's kind of how I look at the case examples. If you want to get into more specific examples, we can.
So, with that being said, you talked about how this has really changed. In the past, was it more a crime of opportunity, where more it's a much more planned out crime?
It's a great point to bring up. So, back in the good old days when it was mostly just straight theft, uh, there was a component of it. There was a decent component of it that we used to call, grab bag theft, where they would just take any trailer that wasn't married or any tractor and trailer that was sitting there, and they would take it, and then, they would take it someplace not too far away and see what they had. And a lot of times, back in those days, if it was not something they thought they could move or sell right away, we'd find it abandoned, right? Or we'd find it, they might take a pallet or two, and almost like so they could have a sample size and go to their fence and go, hey, are you interested in this? And so we would find it in that time frame when they were trying to figure out if they could sell it or not. Or sometimes, like I said, they would just abandon it. I always use an example of I had a client call me once and say, hey, we had a truckload of potting clay stolen yesterday from a truck stop. And I said, that'll show up, you know, and because they won't know what to do with it. And shortly thereafter it did. It showed up, parked on a side road somewhere. Uh, and so, but there was also a lot of targeting. So I don't want you to think it was all grab bag. There was also a lot of surveillance outside of distribution centers, planting employee or planting members of their crews as employees at distribution centers so they could mark trailers that were leaving the distribution centers and the warehouses. The crews knew which trucks to follow. But there was a lot of just almost guessing, like, hey, let's just take this truck and trailer, see what we have, or shopping. They'd go to a lot, there'd be 10 trucks in there, they'd open every trailer and then pick the one that they wanted and take that one. Nowadays, to your point, it is much more targeted. I can't say this enough lately. I think the industry in general underestimates just how sophisticated these international crews are that have taken over the strategic theft in the US and their ability to move almost any commodity, but even more so, their ability to dial in to the exact commodities they want to fill the orders that they have for their client base.
You bring an important point up. Two things that you said that I want to peel the onion on a bit. You had started that said, hey, in the past it was carried out or orchestrated locally. Based on what we've seen, it's still carried out locally, but it's orchestrated sometimes even outside the United States.
Mm-hmm.
How much of this do you think is really being orchestrated outside the US?
We think the majority, most of the intelligence and myself and several other experts, we get together pretty regularly and share notes and share intel and discuss what we're seeing. Plus, we hear what law enforcement is talking about, and so we share intel, we put it all together, and I would say that we all agree that the majority of strategic theft is being coordinated from elsewhere. To your point, Joe, the people over here who are committing it, quite often when we see big arrests, and law enforcement, is doing an amazing job here, especially California, NYPD, the FBI, and Homeland Security. Lately, the cooperation has been fantastic, and the results have shown it. But when you see arrests of 9 people or a dozen people, my comment is always, we're not arresting the head of the snake. They're arresting the regional manager and the local employees. To your point, intelligence that's out there says that India, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Moldova are places where we see some of these crews operating from. And if the head of the snake is over there, when the arrests are made over here, it's a simple, short matter of time before they just replace those employees, so to speak.
Now it's interesting, and for those of you who haven't joined, these are we don't script these questions. So when Scott gives me an answer, it kind of reminds me to ask. It's like, oh, okay, he just said something that really sparked something. The countries that you made mention of, we're doing an ELD study, and we see a lot of ELD white labels coming out of those same countries. How do you think technology plays into cargo theft? I know it does help prevent, but is it also making it easier to do cargo theft? And how do you think, things like the tracking and the technology help or hurt?
Yeah, I'm cautious to say it makes it easier, but I do think it becomes a double-edged sword. To your point, I think that we can see both the value of the prevention, and how much we need to dovetail that into what we do. But we also see, to your point, the manipulation of it, whether it's getting through a vetting platform, which then, if they get through the vetting platform, it almost lends itself to credibility, right? Or when you mentioned the ELDs, I just saw a presentation um, at a conference I was at where um, somebody from the ATA was talking. My friend Dave from the ATA was talking, and he mentioned that the FMCSA has recently kicked out, I think, 90 ELD
Mhm.
companies, right? Or maybe, don't quote me on the number, but it was a pretty significant number, um, for the exact reasons you're bringing up, suspicions about nefarious activity or credibility or things like that. So I think these international rings that are very sophisticated, and when I stress how sophisticated they are, I think that you're looking at rings that are being operated by people who are professional criminals or maybe have some military or intelligence based background or things like that. So we're not dealing with just a average level, hey, Joe and Scott decided to be cargo thieves tomorrow type person. And so they see the opportunity to manipulate the technology that the industry leans so heavily into. And so I do think it can be a double edged sword. I think there's no intent, obviously, uh, from a lot of these companies that we see providing technology here in the United States. But when you see them say, oh, well, there's an ELD mandate, so we'll create bogus ELD companies so that we can manipulate location and tracking and things like that. You can find ads online for logbook editing. Why would you need logbook editing, right? So we know that there is some double-edged sword to some of this. We think that they use that to manipulate it, which is why I always stress the foundation of everything you do has to be human. The foundation of everything you do when you're vetting your carriers and you're trying to prevent theft and everything has to be based on good process and procedures on your human based, your people based team. You can't take the personal touch, the people touch out of your vetting process and your prevention process. You then enhance it with technology. You don't lean on it.
One of the it's That's a great point, and I agree. I mean, technology is great, but you still have to sometimes pick up the phone and verify. In this industry, one of the questions I've gotten before is, hey, this is a very trusting industry. So it's
Right.
almost against the grain to not trust. Do you think that's impacted cargo theft because it is an industry that's so trusting over the years?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I talk about this often that, right out of high school, my first job was driving a truck, a box truck. And then I ended up liking it and liking the people involved in it. And I drove flatbed when I was in college to help pay for college and things like that. And as I grew up in the transportation industry, one of the things I loved the most about it was it's salt of the earth people, right? It's just great
Yeah.
people in general. And I've made some amazing friendships and relationships over the years. And so much of it, to your point, Joe, is built on trust and just knowing that you're dealing with good people and people with good intent. Even, when I try and tell people all the time, drivers, I've dealt with so many drivers just at the driver level doing investigations. And I can tell you, the average driver is not a good victim. They do not make a good victim. They take it very seriously that they're being entrusted with the goods of others, and they do not like being a victim when it comes to cargo theft. So yeah, I think the industry largely has operated on, a handshake in good faith type of mentality, and we'll all be we may argue. It's almost like a family, right? The supply chain, the different parts of the supply chain, shippers, freight brokers, carriers, you name it, they'll all argue with each other, but we all are the same family operating to get to the same place. So even if there's arguments, there's a certain level of trust or desire to trust one another in there. And the thieves exploit that all the time now, which is a shame because it's taken the industry from, hey, we can operate on a level of trust to now you have to trust but verify everything.
Yeah, it's probably 20 some years ago. I remember I had to go to a truck yard to look into an issue. And I'm like, well, do I need a pass? They're like, no, just go back there. And
Yeah.
I mean, there were keys and trucks, cargo was there. Drivers just came up, hey, very nice. I mean, and I was almost amazed. That's when I first got introduced to the industry.
Yes.
And, I think that's one of the unfortunate things. To your point, the drivers take it super personal because again, it's something they're responsible for,
Yep.
and they feel if that gets stolen, they're to blame, which a lot of times they're not.
Right.
What about with emerging trends? We've talked a lot about trends on the theft side. What are some of the trends that you've seen on the enforcement side? You mentioned a couple states where they've been able to make some significant changes. For example, you mentioned California. We've read some articles and posted some things about Tennessee. What are some of the trends regarding the things the state is doing?
I think California is a great example. California, when you look at the CargoNet numbers, California is always number one. And in all of my time doing cargo theft, California has always been number one. The rest of the top 10 will change. There was a period of my career where Florida was number two. Recently Texas has been number two for a long period of time. Illinois was number two at one point way back for a few years. Everything will change in that top 10 other than California. Ironically, no state in the nation has more law enforcement dedicated to cargo theft than the state of California. So you can't look at California and say, well, they're just not addressing it. They certainly are addressing it. You have the CTIPS task force, which is the California Highway Patrol Task Force. Such a fantastic group of men and women. I say this all the time. The amount of busts, it seems like every week they're hitting a warehouse and they're recovering millions of dollars in freight for people. They're making arrests. You have the LA County Sheriff's task force. You have the LAPD task force. There's another county task force over there as well. I think Inland Empire is just now forming a new task force recently. So plenty of resources being put around it. Now, I'm sure everybody could always say, well, we need more. Well, we always need more. there's no argument there. But California is a great example of a state that's, put a lot of resources around it. It remains a problem, right? And that goes back to something I always say, which is we're never going to solve or get rid of cargo theft. We're just going to have to deal with it. I think recently, here in my home state of Arizona, uh, the legislature and the governor just passed a bill to mandate the forming of a state-wide task force on cargo theft. And we have an intelligence meeting today for the Southwest Transportation Security Council Arizona chapter, where we're seeing great engagement by law enforcement. The Attorney General's office comes to that and meets with everybody in both industry and law enforcement combined. We're seeing the rail get involved in that. I think Tennessee is passing the same type of legislation where they're going to stand up a task force. And I think, Dale Prax is really good at this. He tracks all this. And I think he's got 6 states right now in total that are looking at standing up task forces or forming some sort of mandate for task forces. You know, Illinois used to have a great state police unit. It would be great to see that come back. New Jersey has a state police team that does it. NYPD has a fantastic gentleman that leads their efforts over there, and he's got a good team of people. They've had some recent busts. Florida still has the Miami-Dade task force and the statewide task force. Tennessee still has a couple. Kentucky, they had a task force for a while. All the members of that retired. I think they still have one officer doing it now. So you do see some states stepping up for this. We also, even if they don't have designated task forces, Illinois does have the recent county task force that stood up, and they've already had a fantastic impact. Had millions in recoveries already. They attended the latest TAPA summit, and so we are seeing some county-based task forces in Illinois. But even in some of the states where you don't have designated task forces, TAPA takes requests, and we get pretty regular number of requests for law enforcement training. Over the years, there's been training where experts like Keith Lewis and John Cannon and Gary Thomas and myself and Cornell Hildenbrand fly out, and we do free training for law enforcement. So, there's been requests in Ohio, there's been requests in Mississippi, there's been requests in Indiana, and so Nebraska, Oklahoma. So we continue to see engagement, even if there's no designated task forces in a lot of these states, which is good too, right? I think you don't necessarily have to have a designated task force if you're willing to, attack it. I don't think it matters to anybody in the private sector whether you're a task force member or not, as long as you're going after it and you're trying to have an impact on it. So I think you're seeing more and more activity at the state level. Of course, we'd like to see Corca passed, which would give that federal task force mandate. But I'm really happy to see the states standing up some of these task forces.
I know you've got a lot of passion as far as terminology within cargo theft, and you focus on this during your training. Can you describe a little bit about the differences of cargo theft and why that's so important to actually label the cargo theft correctly?
Sure, I think that the industry needs to operate on a regular vernacular that we can all use all the time. And I think that, when you hear terminology like freight fraud, what does that mean? What qualifies as freight fraud? Freight fraud really isn't a bucket, right? There's really 2 buckets. There's straight theft and there's strategic theft. Freight fraud, again, is a very generalized term. So what does that mean? Well, within the strategic theft bucket, there's MC number fraud, and that's fraud, right? We look at that as fraud. But strategic theft in general encompasses identity theft, fictitious pickups, double brokering scams, cluster thefts, MC number fraud, all these things. Now we've seen, and then there's the straight theft bucket, which is when they physically go out and they steal it. What we've seen over the years is that law enforcement, even the FBI on their website, they use the straight theft versus strategic theft. I'm not sitting here, I'm not trying to trying to be the vocabulary police and say, well, you can't say freight fraud or whatever, but describe what it is. Don't let's just not throw general terms out. Let's talk about what specifically do you mean? Because if I go back to the example of when strategic theft was really only 2% of all cargo theft, fictitious pickup was the favorite of the two methods. So we just called everything fictitious pickup back then. Well, then as more methods started to evolve and we had 5 methods, 6 methods, 7 methods, things like that, you can't say fictitious pickup because it means one specific method. And that impacts, how do you investigate it? What's the liability of it? Who's at fault? How did it happen? So you have to start creating different names for all the different methods, and then you have to have a bucket to put them in. So that's where strategic theft came from and straight theft came from. Freight fraud, certainly to me, when you say freight fraud, I think MC number fraud because that's where I see the fraud element in cargo theft. So I just think it's better for the industry to operate on a common vernacular that we're sharing with law enforcement, private sector, our business partners, and all that.
One of the discussions we had yesterday, I thought was really interesting. It's not something that I've been focused on, or we've been focused on, but I think that, and that's communication between the shipper and the carrier as far as the value of the load that's being carried, what's being carried, how susceptible it is. And you had even mentioned that sometimes these loads are sold before they're stolen. I mean, they've already got buyers. Talk a little bit about the criticality of that communication between the shipper, the carrier, and if applicable, the broker.
It's a great topic that you're bringing up, Joe. I think when you look at, when you see, let's use the high tech thefts that have been plaguing the industry recently. I think that's the best example that serves this topic. We've seen loads valued anywhere from 2.3 million to 38 million stolen in that category. And it's alarming. And when you see some of it, when you look into some of it, you see some of these loads, 20 plus million, 30 plus million are double brokered, or there doesn't seem to be much screening around some of them. Some of them had security escorts on it. So you're seeing good things there. And I think what you would find if you looked at the ones that had higher levels of security put on them, you'd find there was probably better communication over the values. Because when you have a load that's, let's just say 20 million, just use an easy number. Let's say you have a load that's 20 million. If you don't tell somebody, if you're a shipper and you don't tell the freight broker that this load's worth 20 million and there's a theft, and you're sitting there going, well, why didn't you put better security around it? Well, because we didn't know it was worth $20 million. Because that wasn't communicated to us that it was worth $20 million. And if you'd have told us it was worth $20 million, we may have done X, A, B, and C, X, Y, and Z. So I think communication around values is important. Now, you can have a declared value that you want to put on your paperwork or whatever. You do that how you want to do that. But if you're getting a freight broker to move a load that's worth even $2 million, if we go down to the lower level of that category, even $2 million, you should make it clearly known that it's worth $2 million. And it's also a commodity that's being highly targeted right now. And then have some communication around, are you going to have a higher standard of vetting the carrier? Are you going to have a higher standard, vetting the carrier for security? Are you going to have a higher standard around communication around the movement of that freight? Who's going to handle that freight? If you're not using a freight broker and you have a designated carrier that's going to do it, this goes back to the comment you and I made earlier. Truck drivers take that responsibility seriously. So talk to that trucking company about the fact that we're hiring you to move a $2 million load or a $20 million load. And so we really need to have good communication with your driver. We need to co-monitor the tracking. We need to be contacted immediately if anything goes wrong. Here's a CargoNet report on the route that load's going to take. So you can see all of the theft activity along that route that you're about to take for that particular type of commodity. Are we making sure that we're sharing awareness and knowledge and intelligence about what's being moved? That communication all has to start taking place because the cargo thieves are zeroing in on that gap between shipper and broker communication for these types of thefts. And that's why you see when you look at the CargoNet numbers, the number one location for theft is the warehouse. They're not breaking into the warehouses. That's where the freight changes hands. That's where it's given from the good guys to the bad guys unintentionally and unknowingly. And that they see that as the weakest link in the supply chain right now because it is.
Right. And I know that a lot of the times when we talk to law enforcement, and let's say they've recovered, they'll talk about, hey, the driver didn't even realize he had a truck full of laptops back there.
That's right. That's right. Over and over
And
again.
he's like, if he would have, he would have done things differently. And then the other thing is, if the carrier knows it, they're probably going to assign that load to someone that's carried high value loads before, or has, to your point, gone through the additional vetting. They typically have processes for those high value loads.
Agreed.
All right, let's go, Marley. Let's go on to the next slide. I could have asked questions all day on that. So I want to talk a little bit about the threat portal. When we were at our conference last year, that even on the cybersecurity side, we had a CIO, CTO stand up and say, "Hey, when I'm hit by a cybercrime, I just wish I had a way to tell everybody. This industry shares so much technology. I just want to know." I don't have time to pick up the phone. I don't have time to email everyone. I'm fighting the fire. I wish there was a way to do this. They also said sometimes I don't want my name associated to it. I want it anonymous. But I want other people in the industry to know, hey, so and so was impacted. Or we've been hit by, and I'm just using this as an example because I saw a CISO alert, an Oracle bug, um, or an Oracle exploit. So that's why we did the threat report portal. It also came up in a cargo theft because the one of the brokers involved in the tequila heist was Sammy Hagar and Guy Ferrari. He was telling his story. And it was really amazing because the group came together to try to figure out how could they have prevented it? What practice or operation change could they have made? So we launched the threat portal. And what that and it's not something that we charge for. And all that we ask is, yes, you're going to receive information on these cyber crimes, on the cargo thefts. But, we ask that you submit it also. One person said, well, can I get them and not submit? No, it's an agreement that you're going to do both. And so, I looked right before this meeting or before this conference, and Scott, it's a lot of things that you talked about. Just this week, we saw something related to copper wire. That's $200,000 is a fictitious pickup. Another one related to air conditioning lines, copper tubes, redirection. And another one, again, it was fictitious pickup. So these are most of what we're seeing in this is a fictitious pickup. Now, while we did see copper wire, copper tube, one of them was protein powder. And the things that are being stolen are probably different than traditionally what you think. A lot of times, at least I'll date myself, you think of electronics, you think of the cigarette truck from Beverly Hills Cop. You don't think of protein powder, protein drinks. Why has what's being stolen, why has that changed so much versus what it was in the past?
Well, I think a big part of it is that, especially when we talk about these very sophisticated international rings, they have a customer base. They have basically created their own economy, right? They've created their own black market supply chain economy. And so they're filling orders. And I can't stress that enough. I think people just don't realize that they're filling orders. And they have a specific requests. They also, it's not, and that's not to say that everything they steal is an order that they're filling, but they are also just so much better. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier, Joe, back in the old days where it was a little bit more of a guessing game, or, a grab bag theft here and there. Even if they sat surveillance back in those days outside of a distribution center, they had a pretty good idea what they were getting, but they didn't know 100% of the time what they were getting. Well, nowadays, I think most of the time they know exactly what they're getting, and they can look at that commodity now because they're bidding on it on load boards, because they're having communications with the freight broker about what the freight is and things like that. They're able to say, oh, we can sell that. That's a product we can move, and they're able to kind of pick and choose more what they want and do so more accurately. I think another component of that is that they can target freight in what we consider non-traditional areas of the United States for cargo theft, where people are even less on guard. So they can specifically target a lot of the commodities they want, coming out of areas that traditionally haven't had to really keep an eye on outgoing shipments for cargo theft because they haven't been really hit by it in the past. So I think they've just gotten really good at dialing in on the freight, knowing exactly what they need for their customers or what they think that they can find a market for and move. And I think I keep going back to these data center type of commodities being stolen as a testament to just how sophisticated these rings have to be. How dialed in do you have to be to sell things like that? Because there are certain things you can move overseas that, a small store in another country would have no idea by the time it's moved through the legitimate supply chain that they're buying something stolen. But commodities like those data center loads, the buyer has to know that those things are stolen. You're not moving things like that without everybody knowing exactly what's going on with that type of commodity. So that, I think, just speaks to how sophisticated they are, which explains how good they are at dialing into the commodity.
I read something recently about how long stolen cargo stays in the United States. What's your opinion? Once a load is stolen, if it's destined to leave the United States, how quickly do you think it's gone?
I think there's a lot of things it depends on. I think the commodity, the crew, things like that. A little over a year ago, there was a big bust here in Peoria, Arizona, and a little over $3 million. Peoria PD busted it, and I think this was a good example of what I think goes on pretty regularly. The majority of the stuff there was being repalletized and getting ready to be moved out of the country. But over on the other side of the warehouse, they had stood up an online store and they were filling small orders. So their mentality was, we'll sell as much of it as we can so we don't have to ship it. We don't have to move it out of the country. And we'll do that online. And they had a packing station and they were filling orders, mixed orders over on one side of the warehouse, but they were getting the bulk of it ready to move it out of the country. Now, a while ago, I worked a case on, I'm not going to name the brand, but headphones, right? A popular brand of headphones. In a week after we opened the case, they were pinging in Europe. So that's really quick, right? But then you look at some of these really good busts that, NYPD recently had, or the FBI, or, C-tips, or the sheriffs, the LA County sheriffs in California, and they're busting warehouses with millions of dollars of freight in there. There's a part of me that has always believed that they're a victim of their own success in the movement of some of their freight. They steal so much of it that they almost choke their own supply chain to a little bit of a grinding halt. And so it sits in these warehouses while they're figuring out how to move it, how quickly can they get it out, are they laundering it, are they redoing the paperwork, are they repacking some of it depending on what it is, things like that. So I really think it depends on the commodity. I think it depends on the crew, how you know how well they've picked the freight that they've stolen and how quick their customers need it. I don't think there's a set answer. What we do know is that prior to this massive increase in strategic theft, probably 6 or 7 out of every 10 loads stolen in the US stayed in the US. Recoveries used to be much easier. Not that recoveries were ever easy, but compared to today, recoveries are much more difficult now, and that's in large part because 6 or 7 out of every 10 loads now leaves the country. How fast that happened, I think there's a lot of elements that go into that.
Yeah, but 6 or 7 out of 10 is huge. I mean, I can remember I lived in Southern California and they talk about auto theft and they said, hey, if your car is stolen, you got about 2 hours or it's gone. It's out of the country. Being down there by the border.
Well, we
Let's,
recently saw a case, to your point, we recently saw a case where a Lexus vehicle was, seized at the port, getting ready to go out, on a case that we were working, right? And so, to your point, that these things are all being moved out as quickly as they can. I think the perishable stuff tends not to leave. When we see the rash of frozen
yeah.
meat and seafood taken, NYPD and New Jersey State Police and everything, like they're finding a lot of that stuff at open air markets and small bodegas and stuff like that because it's perishable. So they don't really go through the effort of trying to move that out of the country as much when it's perishable and there's a short, window of their ability to sell it. When you get into, hard commodities, that's much easier for them to move. And I think we see a lot of that moved out of the country now.
Yeah, I think the flea markets just, not that they're bad, but just have a lot of this stuff, where it comes from.
Yep.
So let's on the next slide talk a little bit about prevention. Um, we've both talked about verification, but it's not a one size fits all. Talk a little bit about verification to prevent this, or at least slow it down, and what some recommendations are as far as layered verification.
I think this is one of the areas where I'm most excited about, our two organizations starting to communicate and work together is I think, in our conversations, there's been a strong belief that, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, you can't remove the human touch, right? You can involve technology, but you can't replace the human touch with technology 100%. And so when you look at carrier verification, last year, June of 2025, TAPA released the freight broker security requirements. Now, post Montgomery ruling, we're changing some of the wording and we're updating those and everything because of some concerns around wording with the post Montgomery. But either way, they still provide a fantastic foundation of process and procedure. To me, everything prevention wise, whether it's strategic theft or straight theft, always starts with good process and procedures. And we could talk all day on what that means and how that's defined. And it's different for every company or client that I work with or member that I work with, things like that. But if we just use some examples, one of the things I always talk about is there's a tendency to concentrate knowledge at a company within one or two people, the risk manager or the head of security or something like that. But I think you and I just talked about this recently, Joe. They're not working at the dock. They're not loading the truck.
Mhm.
They're not seeing the truck or the driver that shows up at the dock. They're not on the phone with the carrier or the bad guy who's pretending to be a carrier, things like that. So part of that process is, are you training your frontline staff? Are you training the people that are actually right there ground level at that point of exchange, whether it's the booking of the freight or the loading of the freight on the truck? You're not trying to create a bunch of experts, but you're trying to create a spider sense that develops into communication when they see red flags, the acknowledgement of red flags, um, having the confidence to speak up when they see those red flags. That's part of good process and procedure. If you're talking about straight theft, it's, what we talked about earlier, that communication with the driver of, hey, you're hauling electronics out of Southern California. We're going to send you some information on where these commodities are stolen the most along your route, right? Can we avoid those truck stops when possible? Do you have hard locking devices, things like that? And then you get into that second layer, which would be the use of technology in brokerage divisions or in brokerage operations and hard locking devices in trucking operations. And then that third layer to me is always, the enhancement of everything you do with technology. So I think when you talk about the layered approach. It's having that foundational process that is human driven. We're going to Google things. We're going to take a closer look at stuff. We're going to compare the phone number that's in this vetting platform with the phone number that's on the FMCSA. We're going to decide which one's valid. We're going to do a quick Google. Gary, who works for me, always says, "Hey, we're going to open a business, $20 a month, and we're just going to Google every carrier that you're going to book." Because so many times we see a theft where they use the platform and they just depended on what was in the platform, and then Gary Googles the company, and you realize, hey, this was a hotshot hauler out of upstate New York, and you just booked them on a load in Southern California, right?
Yeah.
And if you would have just Googled them, you would have seen that. And so I think everything should start with good process and procedures. Creating a culture internally is part of that too. A culture where your team feels like they're almost engaged in a sport against the bad guys. Hey, the bad guys are here to beat us every day. We're here to beat them. And you encourage that good behavior. When somebody prevents a theft, you reward them, Amazon gift card or something like that. You stand them up in front of the team and have them talk about what they spotted. Developing and promoting a real good culture internally is part of that. But having good process and procedures, to me, is the foundation of everything you have to do before you get into technology and other types of enhancement.
Yeah, culture. We saw it like 10 years ago where safety became part of the culture. And I think whether it be cyber or whether it be cargo theft, it does need to become part of culture. That means train everybody. Train the drivers for awareness, train the guard shack, train the guys running the forklifts. Doesn't matter. It just, I agree with you, needs to become part of the culture.
Yep.
So Marley, I'm going to hand it off to you for the next few slides.
Yep, sounds good. So, due to sake of time, great conversation. But I might not go into the actual Freight Fraud Prevention Hub website, but I will kind of speak a little bit to a few new resources that we do have. And while I do that, I will pop up another slide that does showcase our partners. So we do have 30 to date. You can see here we've got a great mix of 3PLs, brokers, carriers. Also, we've got the NMFTA logo amongst as this is an industry first initiative. So we are one of the partners in this, although we do oversee and manage it. But you'll see there the TAPA logo, as well as some podcast partners, as well as Truckers Against Trafficking, another nonprofit. So very excited to have these organizations on board as partners. And with that, I did want to share that of these logos, we do have a few new. We've got speaking of kind of the personal human element, right? We do have a shipper verification workflow resource that has been shared by our friends over at HallPay as of recent. And then also our friends at GLCS has provided us with an insightful blog. And not too long ago, GeoTab also has given us the opportunity to share one of their white papers. So again, we're always looking to partner with those who want to join. So if there's an interest, there is definitely a slide here. So that's how you can get to the partner program. There is a very simple form on the website. Just put in your information, possibly upload a logo, share a little bit more about why you'd like to be a part of this initiative, and we will certainly get back with you. And I know, Joe, also, we will be having another webinar. So this will be the Q4 in December prior to the holiday season. So definitely mark your calendars for December 17th to join us. And lastly, and I will defer to you, Joe, but we do have our cybersecurity conference that will be taking place in Long Beach the end of September. So if there is an interest there, we certainly encourage, especially motor carriers, to join us at that.
Yeah, the cyber conference, it is the only one that's in the trucking industry. And again, probably 40% of the agenda is what we talked about, cargo crime. And the biggest thing about it is it's not a huge group. We don't want it to be. It is a smaller group. It's very interactive. We do everything from tabletop exercises to focus on asset and non-asset. So it's really focused on the industry. So you won't, the things that you hear, the things we talk about are really applicable. So we do encourage folks to go ahead and sign up for it. Again, to like Marley said, it is in Long Beach, the end of September. Also includes like I said, things you can take away from the conference, like sitting down doing a tabletop exercise. But a lot of people aren't exposed to maybe the asset side. So we're going to talk about some of the things that were recently in a Black Hat presentation with a Bendix vulnerability that was discovered. But then also talk about some of the new tools that we've developed. So encourage everybody to go. So, Scott, really appreciate the time, the insight. Any last words that we've got a few minutes left? Any last words that you've got for the folks on the webinar?
No, I think we covered a lot of good materials. I can't think of anything that we really missed out hitting on other than, let's make sure we're talking to one another, communicating, sharing intelligence. And as I always say, for the love of Pete, don't put your solutions on LinkedIn, please, for the bad guys to see. I think we have a question in the attendee thing. I don't know if we can take questions or not, Marley. That's up to you guys. But I really appreciate you guys having us on. Really looking forward to working with you guys.
Okay. And that question just popped up for me, so I think you got it before I did. Can you share a recording of the presentation? I wasn't able to catch the first 20 minutes. So Marley, can you respond to that one? As far as
Correct.
if this
Yes,
is recorded?
it is. And we will be sending an email by close of business today with that recording. So, yes, it will be in your inbox.
Awesome.
And Scott, I want to reiterate what you said about sharing. The bad guys are working together.
Yes.
A lot of
All of
people
them.
think they're isolated, the guys with hoods in their basement. This is a business for them. They are working together. They are trading uh, information. They are exchanging best practices. So really, the only way to beat that is if we do the same thing on our side as an industry. We talk about best practices, and if you think about how things have changed in the last couple years, they've changed in the last couple months. They've changed in the last couple weeks. So it's not like we can put a stake in the ground and claim victory. As they continue to work together and evolve, as you mentioned in one of your responses, how they've evolved and gotten better, that means we've just got to get that much better. So again, Scott, appreciate the insight, appreciate your time and TAPA support.
Thank you all for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks all.
Thank you.